I think we can begin. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out today to our wonderful event on preparing traditional Indigenous foods with Indigikitchen and Mariah Gladstone. My name's William Carson. I'm the program coordinator for Indigenous Wellbeing. So we do a variety of events for the University of Arizona student body as well as Tucson community, which is about just about promoting like wellness for the Indigenous community here by inviting a variety of speakers and all kinds of areas of expertise, sharing their amazing abilities as well as how they promote wellness in their everyday lives. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our presenter today, a person who I personally know very well. She and I both went to got our undergrad degrees at the same time at Columbia University, and since then, Mariah Gladstone of Indigikitchen, and since then, she went on to found Indigikitchen and has been teaching all about how to revitalize indigenous foods, and has actually gone speaking at a variety of events, showing various cooking demos, and is actually tomorrow flying out to Rome to go give a presentation to what's the name of the conference again?
It's the World Food Forum.
The World Food Forum, to go be part of their global food program and demonstrate her cooking in front of essentially hundreds or thousands of people. So it's very exciting. So welcome.
Way cooler though.
Yes. Welcome.
Okay, everybody. Niso na tano ko umakesta wakaki no paktutu sitsikitsi tapiksakum. Hello, my name is Walking Raven Woman. My IRS name is Mariah, so you guys are welcome to call me that. I am Blackfeet from Montana, so I got to fly down yesterday down the Rocky Mountain front down here, and it's super exciting to be here with you guys today. So I'm going to be making a couple of recipes and hopefully give you guys a couple of ideas for working with native foods. I work with ingredients from all around the Americas, but I tried to use a lot of things that are available and accessible in this area. So we are going to be making I have grass-fed beef actually. Before I get started, National Grocers was very, very generous in letting us use this space, but also in donating all the ingredients to this demonstration. So we walked around the store and picked up all the ingredients for this beforehand, so they're all available here. So I'm using grass-fed beef. If I was at home and I had access to ground bison, I may use that. You can, of course, make it vegetarian, or you can use ground turkey if you wanted another indigenous option, or any wild game meat, of course. So we'll be making stuffed acorn squash with a wild rice and grass-fed beef filling. I'm so sorry that this is loud. I have wild rice that I got in the store, and I have that simmering on the stove top right now. Wild rice is not actually a rice, it is a grass seed, and it grows around the Great Lakes region in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan areas. And it is traditionally harvested in two-person teams by canoe, where one person uses a long stick to push the canoe by pushing off of the bottom of the water, and another person uses two sticks to shake the top of the grass seeds so they fall off into the bottom of the canoe. Of course, not all of the grass seed goes inside the canoe, and inevitably it will fall off to the sides as well, but that process actually helps the grass reseed itself. So wild rice has co-evolved with people and has in part come to rely on harvesting by people to regenerate itself, but it is also a species that is threatened by climate change, both with drought as well as development alongside the 10,000 lakes of Minnesota, and how people want fresh access to their waterfront beaches without having to pass through all this grass. So they've ripped out a lot of wild rice. So I like to cook with it because I think it helps people recognize some of the value to these plants that are sometimes just considered pest plants in this area, the area of the Great Lakes. So I'm gonna cook that up, but I'm also gonna cut this butternut squash, this acorn squash up and get it roasting in this oven, which may also be a loud thing because it's a convection oven. So I'm sure you guys have seen an acorn squash. If you haven't cooked with them before, they're super easy to cook with. Acorn squash are a winter squash, which means they have this hard outside skin. That means that they can sit on your counter and keep for a couple of months without having to worry about refrigeration. Unlike zucchinis, which are a summer squash, or those yellow squash, which are summer squash. And unfortunately, they don't keep as long. You just get to enjoy them during zucchini season window, and you get to save your winter squashes for a little bit longer into the season. So the outside of acorn squash, this peel on the outside, is generally not a part that people eat. And so what we're going to do is actually use our squash and make a bowl out of it. So, or 2 bowls out of it. So I'm gonna cut this in half. These are not my knives, so they are probably not as sharp as I would like them. Something to be aware of when you're cooking, sharp knives are generally less dangerous than dull knives, because sharp knives you don't fight with as much. So we're just gonna be really careful. And of course, they're filled with seeds inside. So I'm going to scoop the seeds out when I remember which drawer the spoons live in. So I'm just gonna scoop these out kind of like you would scoop out seeds for a pumpkin that you're carving. And you can roast these seeds up, or you could save them if you wanted to plant them. Lots of ways to deal with the seeds of acorn squash and other winter squashes. And you could actually do this recipe with a butternut squash or a buttercup squash or a, let's see, there's a whole bunch of squashes out there on the shelves that we just looked at. There's a cabocha squash, there's Hubbard squash. I haven't done this with spaghetti squash, but you could, I guess. Oh, it's not working like I want it to. I didn't realize there was parchment paper in this kitchen until I was looking for that spoon. So I found it, but it's not kind to me. So I'm just gonna line this tray with this really quickly. You could grease it, or you don't even have to line it if you don't want to. I just have this cut like this, so I'll place it cut side down, and then I'm going to put it in the oven at about 375 degrees. In the meantime, my rice is cooking, squash is baking. I am going to get started preparing a dessert, which is a super healthy dessert because it's made of beans. So I have a can of white beans. These are great northern beans, but you could use any white beans for this recipe. And I am going to candy some sunflower seeds. I'm gonna toss them with some maple syrup and put them on the other baking dish and put that in the oven as well, so that that maple syrup will crystallize and it'll candy the top of them. So I'm gonna use this for the topping for a cake. So I'm gonna be making a white bean cake, and so you guys will see all the ingredients as I add them. It can be sweetened with maple syrup, or what I'm gonna use for today's sweetener is just agave. So use something that is more local to here. Maple syrup, of course, is an indigenous food, but it comes from places where there are sugar maple trees. So especially from the Great Lakes into the Northeast. Maple syrup is, of course, an early springtime gift when the trees start to wake up, the temperatures are freezing at night, and then they get above freezing during the day, and the trees start sending sap out to all of their leaves and their branches to wake up. That is when people will tap the trunks of the maple trees, collect the sap, and then boil the sap down to concentrate that sugar so that you lose a lot of the water, it boils off, and you end up with beautiful maple syrup. If you heat that syrup up, so if I were to take this syrup, heat it on the stove top up to a point where it's boiling and getting like quadrupled in size, then when you cool it back down, it will actually crystallize into sugar, much more like the granulated sugar in your pantry. And so you can make your own maple sugar just from maple syrup, which is generally cheaper than buying maple sugar in stores. And then sometimes, if you're not stirring it constantly as it's cooling down, it'll start to chunk up into maple candy. You can always put maple candy in a blender or something and blend it right back down into granulated sugar. So you can make your own maple sugar. Pretty sure you can do the same thing with agave, because all granulated sugar is cane syrup. That same process has been done too. It's just changing the crystalline structure of the sugar. Now I'm getting into nerdy science things. I'm gonna get the sunflower seeds going, so I'm just gonna toss these really briefly. So I'm using raw sunflower seeds because the process of toasting them actually will happen as they're in the oven. So if I were already using toasted sunflower seeds, they would be at a higher risk of getting burnt in the oven. This, I'm definitely gonna line with parchment paper because I'm putting maple syrup on it and I really don't want it to stick to my pan. If you guys end up making maple sunflower brittle, no one's gonna be mad, right? So I will mention with the wild rice, I started it right when we were getting started at the beginning. I rinsed it off in the sink, and generally wild rice cooks up with between a 3-to-1 and a 4-to-1 ratio of water to rice, so it expands a lot. This is a cultivated variety of wild rice rather than true hand harvested wild rice, so it doesn't absorb as much water. But I didn't measure it because you can actually just drain the water off at the end when it's done cooking, kind of like you would with pasta. So that can reduce some of your stress, and also then you don't have to worry about all the water boiling off and burning and sticking to the bottom of your pan.
Right, I have a question.
Yes.
Is there a difference between rice and wild rice?
Yes, there is a difference between rice and wild rice. So wild rice is not related to the rice varieties that we have from Asia. It's a grass seed, so it is in an entirely different family. It just happens to cook up the same, only with more water. I wandered around the store for a while looking for wild rice, and I kept checking the rice section, and eventually I realized it was in a cooler. So I did find wild rice, but it was not with the other things that are called rice. So, but I was considering substituting quinoa for a while in this recipe because quinoa is another indigenous grain, though it's from South America. So I was considering substituting that so we had a good indigenous whole grain, but then I found the wild rice. Okay, so I just made sure that my sunflower seeds all have a little bit of maple syrup, and I'm doing the same thing I was talking about before. By heating this up to a certain temperature, it's going to crystallize the sugar when it cools down. So it just gets to go into the oven with my squash. Perfect. So that's not going to take a super long amount of time, but it gives me enough time to work on preparing the rest of the cake. So I'm using sunflower seeds because they're a phenomenal indigenous food. A lot of people have heard of the Three Sisters, of which we're using a couple of today. Corn, beans, and squash are generally considered the Three Sisters, and they were traditionally grown together by native people all the way from the northeast to the southeast to the southwest, of course. Corn grows tall and straight. If you've been in a corn maze, you know what I mean. Beans require a structure to hold on to. Sometimes you put beans by a trellis so that they will grow up the trellis. And squash spreads out on the ground and kind of takes over. If you've been in a pumpkin patch, you know what I mean. But squash does a couple things by taking over the low-lying parts of the garden. It uses its big leaves to shade the ground, which helps prevent weeds from coming up. They don't get enough sunlight, but also helps evaporative loss in the rest of the garden. So water doesn't evaporate as much when squash is shading the ground. So they work together. Beans are also a legume, which means that they have nitrogen-fixing bacteria in their root nodules. And they'll pull nitrogen out of the air and put it into the soil. And that process will help enrich the soil of a valuable nutrient that corn and squash especially need. Sunflowers, on the other hand, are sometimes called the fourth sister because sunflowers are used as a border plant. They're great for planting around your gardens, but they have allelopathic properties, which means that they release toxins through their root systems, which helps inhibit or prohibit the growth of other plants. So they're not great for planting next to corn, beans, and squash, but they're great for planting as a border plant because they help prevent weeds from coming into the garden, and they're sunflowers. They attract pollinators too, which the other plants need. So sometimes sunflowers are a great plant to incorporate in the garden. Also, they're beautiful, and you can use them as cut flowers, and you can eat them. So they have a lot of great properties, and they're wonderful in this. One of my favorite recipes is actually just taking sunflower seeds, grinding them up in a coffee grinder, and adding enough maple syrup so that they stick together. And then you just make them into little cookies, and I'll just toast them really quickly in a pan on the stovetop. That's it. That's the recipe. Which I just finally put on my website. I've been making it for 6 years, and the problem is I never measure my ingredients. I'm just like, yeah, that many sunflowers, we'll just blend it up, and then that's sticking, it's fine. And so I finally had to sit down and measure everything, and there is finally a recipe for it. So It's super fun to make, and you don't even have to cook it if you don't want to. You can just eat protein dough balls that are sweet and full of sunflower seeds. So, if you're looking for a sweet treat, I'm going to find my can opener that I misplaced, and I'm gonna use this blender to blend all of my ingredients. So I need 2 cups of cooked beans, and I was contemplating using some of the tepary beans that are grown here because they are one of the most the most drought resistant bean, and they are smaller than your regular Great Northern beans. They come in brown and white and other varieties too. But I was going to use some white tepary beans, but cooking beans in this time frame is a little challenging, and I wasn't about to take over my hotel room with cooking beans in an Instapot, so I decided not to. But you can also use a can of beans. You can definitely cook your own beans and use dry beans for this as well. I'm going to drain these so I don't have this extra liquid in here. The extra liquid will just throw off the ratios, and then Billy will be right and I'd need more flour and it would turn into a crisis. So I'm just going to drain the liquid off of here. The liquid actually that's in beans is, of course, it's kind of goopy from that starch that comes off in the beans. So if you're making a soup with beans, it actually helps to keep that liquid in there because it will help thicken the soup. But for this, I don't need the extra liquid. So I know that this is just about exactly 2 cups of beans. If you are not using a can of beans, you have to measure. Notice there's a hand washing sink behind me. Okay, so I am putting 2 cups of white beans in here. And need 6 eggs. Before I get distracted. Pulling out the sunflower seeds, which are all toasted, and they're gonna cool down, and then we can break them apart because they'll become the topping for this cake. Otherwise I'll just have burnt sunflower seeds. That would be no good. So I'm actually gonna use 6 eggs. This is like the most protein-packed cake in the universe. This recipe is also on my website. I have sweetened this with maple syrup before. I have sweetened it with agave, and I've sweetened it with honey. So you can use whatever you have on hand.
It's not distracting. What made you start Indigikitchen?
What made me start?
Like what was how did you start?
Ooh, so I was really lucky to grow up eating some traditional foods, including elk and moose that my family would hunt. In Montana, we have a lot of wild trout, and my dad and my grandpa built me a garden, fenced it away from our dogs. So I was really lucky that I was able to grow up seeing the magic of seeds turning into plants that I could pull out of the garden and eat with dirt still on them and bring inside even as a second grader and feed my family sweet corn and all sorts of things like that. So I was able to see that process and really missed a lot of those traditional foods when I was away at college in New York City. I actually flew to New York one time coming back from winter break with frozen moose meat in my carry-on bag because I was like, if they lose my luggage, I don't want the moose meat to thaw out, so I'm just gonna pack it like enclosed in my carry-on tote so that it will be insulated while I'm flying across the country. So I definitely tried to keep incorporating those foods while I was away. But then when I returned back home after college, I realized that a lot of the work that I had studied in environmental engineering and sustainability was hard to even begin doing when my community still wasn't able to feed itself and we didn't have food sovereignty, this concept of being able to take care of ourselves in that way. So, pause. So I actually started a job. I was working for the railroad doing engineering management, and I was a steel gang roadmaster, which basically meant that I was the boss of 35 guys that would rip out the railroad tracks and then put new railroad tracks in because I had an engineering degree. And I took vacation days to go to a food sovereignty conference and ended up joking with someone. Well, I was half serious. I said, someone just needs to start a cooking show where we can learn how to use indigenous foods again. And I said, I'm just gonna do it and I'm gonna call it Indigikitchen. And someone said, okay, Mariah, sure you are. So then I had to do it. I'm not trained in culinary arts. I'm not trained in videography. And so I just had to start learning what I was able to, using my janky camera setup that I think I bought off of eBay for cheap, but tried to figure out how to make my tripod not go every time I put my heavy camera on it. So got started just doing what I knew and then continued to build on that knowledge. But from the very beginning, people seem to be really excited about the material and about learning more about foods. Foods are a great vehicle to talk about a lot of other issues and also just to share meals with family and friends and to be able to take care of each other and to say that, hey, we are a community that cares about ourselves and wants to be resilient, and therefore we eat good foods. And I think that that's something that I've always stressed is just adding to people's knowledge base rather than trying to come in and say like, fry bread is bad, or hopovers, or whatever they're called here. That's not where I come from. I'm not here to come in and say all these negative things about foods that have helped us through a period of time that would have otherwise meant starvation. You know, fry bread has a place in our history and our traditions because it helped us survive. But also, we're not at that point where we need to be focusing on survival food. We're in this point of regeneration and re-indigenization. And so I'm just trying to add to the Googleable recipes in Indian country, right? I am adding salt and baking powder and baking soda. I think I have a half a teaspoon of salt, I wrote it down, and it's online as well, guys. I have half a teaspoon of salt, 3/4 teaspoons of baking soda, and 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder. So I'm gonna put that in there. I have half a cup of coconut flour. This is just gonna help absorb the moisture from everything else. Coconuts are all over, so I admit, not a lot of native people here harvested them. They tended to be eaten in other more coastal areas. And then this is my, I think this is just This is 1/3 of a cup of agave. And I need, I'm just using a 1/4 cup of avocado oil. So I'm using avocado oil because it's an indigenous oil. Sunflower seed oil is also native. A lot of native people, if they're cooking something like on the stove, would have traditionally used an animal fat, like tallow. So at home, if I'm cooking something up on the stove top, I'll generally use a tallow. For this, for baking, I'm using avocado oil. Frying with avocado oil is also something that is decent. It has a really high smoke point. It won't start smoking until 500 degrees, which makes it something really good for frying because it has that higher oxidation temperature and it won't start converting to bad things at the lower temperatures. So that's why I enjoy cooking with avocado oil and generally good fats in avocados. And then I found a little bit of vanilla in the pantry here. So I'm gonna see if I can break this open. Somehow this bottle is like almost empty, but also it has plastic on it, so I have a lot of questions. They're opening it with the plastic on it. So I'm gonna add about 1/2 teaspoon in there, just for a little bit of flavoring. If I use maple syrup, the vanilla is generally not necessary because it ends up tasting like vanilla, or it just ends up tasting like maple. So that works out for us. I'm going to blend this. Oh, I don't just have an on button. Okay. I have milkshake. Let's do it. An old blender from college that I have had for so long, but it still works great. The brand name is literally not on it anymore because I've used it so many times that it's rubbed off. So all other blenders are confusing mysteries to me at this point. Sounds like it's doing a lot, but it doesn't look like it's doing a lot. So. Cool. It looks like it's blended. I'm gonna go with it's blended. Milkshake setting, you better work for me. No. Cool. I have a couple of pans here. So generally, I only use one pan about this size. And I make pretty thick pieces of cake because they puff up as they're baking with all the eggs and baking powder and baking soda. But I'm going to make 2 that are a little bit thinner so they'll cook faster for this demo, and we just have an easier way of slicing servings for you guys. If I can make this parchment paper tear like I need it to, it will work really well for making cleanup easy. I know there is a tool that I need somewhere in here. My problem is I don't know where things are in this kitchen. I've been so used to doing cooking demonstrations from my house during COVID and just having my own light set up and being able to just cook things in my own kitchen and do things via Zoom. That I'm finally getting back on the road again, and it's super exciting to be set up and doing demos in other places, and also I'm like, I have no idea where anything is. I'm sorry. Also, it's fun, I actually get a kitchen today. Sometimes when I'm on the road, I'll just be in like a hotel conference room with like an Instapot. And they're like, do a thing, Ryan. I'm like, alright, I can do a thing, but I get to bake things for you guys, which is cooler. Anyway, extra thankful for Natural Grocers for using this space. And also just for offering cooking classes to folks in the community. Divide this evenly up. You guys are just watching me do tedious things. Does anyone have any questions?
I do.
Yeah.
Can you use another flour besides the coconut flour in this cake?
Yes.
Okay.
So for this, I generally like a really fine flour that will absorb a lot of moisture. So you can use a tapioca flour. You could use a rice flour or something if you wanted to use something like that. The best substitution I found for coconut flour is actually when I dehydrate all my zucchinis and then I blend those into flour. It absorbs the same moisture as coconut flour, and it's a very neutral, slightly sweet flour, kind of like coconut flour. So if you're someone that grows a lot of zucchinis and can't figure out what to do with all the zucchinis, I just end up drying a whole bunch of them and grinding them down into flour. So, but there are other things. I just generally look for a pretty fine flour that absorbs a decent amount of moisture. So.
Thank you. Do you have a dehydrator you use, or do you?
I
just
have a
kinda-
dehydrator, but in a pinch I have used my oven at the lowest temperature setting.
Okay.
But I live in a dry place. You guys live in a relatively dry place when it's not rainy season. But you can hang strings right through your living room and thread thin slices of squash on it and dry things out that way too. So that also works. That's what we do with jerky and squash back in Montana, and I know that the dry air of the Southwest is also well suited for that. My partner is from New York, and so I'm always like, you can't just air dry things in New York. It's a different game there. You have to like salt dry things or smoke them or legitimately have a dehydrator and then still pack them with like moisture absorption packets, you know? And that's something that my partner, when we moved in together, he was always very obsessive about making sure that, you know, like the bags and cereal boxes, he would always like roll them very, very tightly closed when he put the cereal like back in the shelf. And I'm just lazy. I just like pour cereal, like close the box, put it back in the shelf, right? And he's like, why are you doing that? It's going to go stale. And I'm like, no, it won't. Like, the air's dry in Montana, so I never like worried about my cereal going stale before the end of the week was over. You know, that just wasn't a concern for me. And, I overheard him talking to one of his cousins on the phone. He's like, the air is so weird here. It's just like, you can just leave bags of chips open and they won't like turn wet. It's like, okay. It's funny. Things about Montana and just generally the West. The air is so dry. Okay, so I'm not trying to make these too beautiful because you know what we're gonna top them with is our candied sunflower seeds. I'm just trying to spread them out to the corners. This is going to expand quite a bit when I get it into the oven. And again, they'll be thin little cake pieces. And I'll make sure that everybody has the recipe if they want it. They can cook them up at home. So I told you guys I was just making like a giant like sunflower brittle. And that is what we did. So now I get to break this. You could just like sprinkle this with a little bit of salt and have it as snacks. Good trail food. Beautiful sunflower brittle. We can arrange it in some decorative, could do cool mosaics if I was like getting really artsy. Instead it's now desert inspired. It looks like cracked ground. I would tilt it up to show you guys, but the cake is obviously liquid and I can't do that. You could even take this and put it like in a blender and blitz it and swirl it through so it was like a coffee cake. I've also done this with walnuts and maple sugar and a little bit of coconut oil, and then blitzed that together and made like a true coffee cake crumble. So, just truly trying to make this.
I have a question from your website.
Yes.
So I saw on there that you made like a squash lasagna.
A squash what?
It was lasagna?
Yes.
Squash? I was just wondering what the idea for that recipe was.
I really like lasagna. So yes, one of my favorite recipes is bison and butternut squash lasagna. So I take butternut squash, which has the long neck, and I'll just take that and slice the skin off of it and cut it into rectangles, like lasagna noodles, and then make a meat sauce, generally with bison meat, and I will just layer that in a lasagna pan and bake it. So the squash is raw when it goes in, and I just bake it until it's fork tender. And then you have delicious layers of using squash instead of pasta noodles. So it's slightly sweet from the squash. And tomatoes are indigenous too. Don't ever let Italians tell you otherwise. I'm about to roll into Rome and just make people angry. Speaking of squash, this looks like it is well on its way to be what we want. And then we're going to put this into the oven. This is a convection oven, so it's like things cook slightly faster. And it blows the air around and it just makes me anxious. No. My dad lived in this weird little one-room cabin for a while that didn't have running water. And we didn't have like a real kitchen or anything. He just had this like box, which was a convection oven. And so I got really good at cooking with that thing. But that was when I was like 13, and now I can't remember how to use it. So it's a fun adventure, but everything seems to be working out like we want it to. So that's baking right now. This is cooling off. Squash has an amazing capacity to hold heat. So if you can flip it over, it'll let it release heat a little bit better. So I just really want to make sure that this is fork tender. And I promise I'm not pressing that hard. It is going through pretty easily, which is what we want. So I'm going to let that cool off. That is doing a thing. Our wild rice is still simmering, which is great. But I am going to move this off to the side because I want to brown our meat and add these green onions, and I have a serrano pepper because we're going to add a little bit of heat. Does anyone want to try a sunflower seed griddle? Go for it. You guys saw the ingredients. It is not magic. Go for it.
It's very light.
What's that?
It's very light, you know, not too
Yeah. No, it's not.
dense. Yeah.
It's not like a heavy dessert. It's just I like it, and I'm like I just want something to snack on that's not. It also doesn't taste wildly sweet.
No.
I mean, this is fairly sweet. It's good topping for the cake.
Oh yeah. I agree.
Is this whole cake kind of like that way, not super sweet?
What's that?
This cake is kind of, it's not like a super strong sweet.
No, the nice part is the eggs and the beans help cut the sweetness a lot, and just kind of it makes it so you know the blood sugar spike that the sugar causes is much more balanced out and tapered because of all of the protein that's in the eggs and the beans. So
It's not like a traditional dessert then almost.
no.
Like when we think dessert, we're thinking like,
Yeah, no, it's I mean, I think it's sweet, and it is almost, if you gave it to someone and did not tell them that it was made with beans, or that it was totally gluten-free or sweetened with agave or anything like that, like they would just think it's cake.
oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. I originally made it like almost an exact like coffee cake copy recipe by mixing up walnuts and stuff and using that for the crumble. So, and then I'll put berries in it sometimes. I'll make it like a blueberry cake or make blueberry muffins or something with it, something like that. Yeah.
Your recipes, is it passed down from generations, or do you add a little flair to it to each item as you go?
That depends. Sometimes I make really traditional things, and I'm like, yep, this is this recipe that has been made in this way in this community, you know, for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And sometimes I wake up one morning and I'm like, you know what? I think I want to see if I can use only indigenous ingredients to make pad thai. And then I'll just try doing that. Because I also think that, you know, like we were mentioning with lasagna, right? Like lasagna is not an indigenous food, but you can make lasagna with all indigenous ingredients, and just make a couple substitutions and use those ancestral foods, look back at what our ancestors gave us and the foods that we have in our communities, and then make something that is easy to make, we can make at the end of a work day, and that our kids will recognize as food. So, you know, I've made like zucchini pizza bites, right? And I will make elk roast in an Instapot. And I'll be like, I'm just gonna lock that in the Instapot and turn that on for an hour and it'll be ready later, right? Because also, I think as Indigenous people, we've always used the tools that we have access to. And if I have access to induction burners and a convection oven, like, these are tools that I can have, but I can also recognize the Indigenous wisdom of centuries of intense agricultural knowledge and breeding that led to us having sunflowers with big edible seeds, and beans that are incredibly drought resistant and have been cultivated specifically for this climate. And look at all of those fun things and then incorporate them using the tools in the kitchen. So it depends. It depends a lot. I was up with my neighbors to the far north on the Blood Reserve, just north of the Canadian border. I have some family up there, and they were doing a Environmental Protection Agency summit, and they did a bison harvest. And they wanted me and an elder to do a live cooking demonstration where also we fed 250 people with the freshly harvested bison. And I don't know if you've ever had fresh harvested meat, but it's tough. They generally, if it gets taken to a butcher shop or something, or even hunters in my family will age the meat. They'll dry age the meat, and that will help tenderize it and make it really nice and what we think of as like nice juicy steaks, or even backstrap. Fresh backstrap is tough. And so they brought me this neck meat in this demonstration. So like butchered the bison, they brought me the neck meat, and I'm like, and I knew this was a plan, so I had brought my Instapot. And I cut it into little pieces, and I locked it in my Instapot for 45 minutes, and I cut up a whole bunch of root vegetables from my garden, which I had huckleberry gold potatoes, which are a low glycemic potato. This elder had gone off and harvested wild carrots. We had onions, we had wild onions, we had all these different root vegetables. So we cut them up and we had them simmering. And then when the Instapot was done, I had nice tender little cubes of bison meat that we could put into this giant soup pot that we had going, because buffalo stew with root vegetables and in bone broth and with nice slow cooked buffalo is very, very, very traditional, like those big one pot meals. We just had adapted it so that it was possible to do it in the amount of time that we had with a freshly harvested animal. So we work with what we have. Right now I have grass-fed beef. So I'm gonna brown this up really quickly. Before I do this, actually, I'm going to chop these things. I almost have wild rice that is done. There's a compost thing in here, so I'm just holding her up on that right now. This knife is so aggravating to me right now. I'm like, the one thing that I should have packed if I was going across the world to go to a cooking demo was my knives. And I didn't do it. I'm just gonna embarrass myself. No. So take that. Yep, I will use garlic. It's not an indigenous food, but so many of the alliums are. And then I'll use onions, just, more like big commercial onions sometimes, because of course there's so many types of wild onions that we have on this continent. It's it's just sometimes harder to get them, and for what I do, sometimes I'm doing things a little out of season.
Yeah.
So, but I do have at home, I'll harvest wild onions and I'll dry them out, and I'll try to incorporate those things. I try to incorporate wild seasonings whenever I can. Down here, you know, chilies are, of course, an indigenous food. Do you guys know why we call them peppers?
No.
So there was this guy, and he was really lost, and he said, I'm going to India to look for spices. And then he wound up here, and he's like, wow, I'm in India. You guys are all Indians. One of these spices I'm looking for is pepper. And he tried something spicy, which was a chili. And he's like, wow, this is pepper. Must be peppers. This is pepper. Columbus was looking for peppercorn, not chilies. But now we call all chilies peppers because Columbus. So anyway, Indians and peppers have something in common, in that Columbus started some mass chaos. I'm taking the seeds out of this just so we don't have super spicy filling for our squash. I'm gonna cook these up with the, I keep wanting to say bison, it's ground beef. I'm gonna cook this up with our meat, so that cooking process will help lose some of the heat on this, and then we'll help cook in some of the flavor of the onions, and we will just end up with good, delicious food. Was so lucky that we got to go down to the co-op on, Billy, what's the name of?
San Javier.
San Javier, yeah. The co-op down there this morning, and they had mesquite cookies made with mesquite flour. So I'm super stoked to start the morning off with mesquite flour cookies. Mesquite is also a legume, like beans, but it's a perennial and it's a tree. So they also help re-enrich the soil with nitrogen. And I know that mesquite sometimes gets treated as a pest plant in certain areas, but it's a delicious food plant, and it's a gluten-free flour, and you could totally substitute mesquite flour in there if you wanted to. So, I was gonna say that's a good. I would sometimes mesquite flour is a little gritty, so you could even like blend it up a little bit more in like a coffee grinder or something first if you were gonna make that substitution. Okay, now we got that. I have to remember not to touch my face. Then we'll get this going. These are induction burners, so if I took the pan off, the burner would stop working. So you just have to remember that. It's a really cool thing, and they cook very effectively and rapidly, but this was the only size of the pan that there was too. So I'm like, yeah, this is fine. It's gonna work to our advantage. So I'm just breaking this down into small pieces.
prairie or anything else?
So I have a question. The bison you made, was it enough for 200 people?
What's that?
That bison you cooked last time for the 200, was it enough? Or?
I'm sorry, I can't hear because of this sizzling.
So the bison you cooked for the 200 people, the stew?
Yeah.
Was it enough?
Yes. Yeah, it worked out. It worked out also because the elder had brought like dried chokecherry patties, and then, they had brought me a ton of neck meat, and we had planned on doing it that way. And so the good thing about bison and bone broth and root vegetables is it's really, really filling. And we had as much bison as we wanted because there was a bison right there, so I could always just say, we just need more meat. And then they were also barbecuing bison right next door to us. So they would bring over like plates of barbecued bison, which were delicious but very tough. So it worked out.
What was the kind of thing you would make when you said you were like in a hotel, like you were in like a hotel conference room with an Instapot?
Yeah. I made white bean cakes one time. So I actually used a portable induction burner that I just plugged into an outlet and my little portable blender, and I blended up white beans, a little bit of masa, some juniper berries for seasoning, and like an egg, so I could make little white bean patties and then crisp them up and serve them with, I could use my blender again and I made a yarrow aioli. Yarrow is an herb that we have at home, and it kind of tastes like tarragon. So I just made a little topping with it, and then I think I had some smoked trout from home to top. So do things like that. I have also I did like an elderberry barbecue sauce, and then put a bison roast in an Instapot, had it cooking under the table, so I could talk about other things, do show and tell with foods, and then I could make, I think I made arepas, and then sliced them in half, pulled out the Instapot, opened it, shredded that bison with the elderberry barbecue sauce, and had like indigenized pulled pork sandwiches, but they were with arepas and bison, and yeah. So there's lots of things that can be done without a full kitchen. And also, as I said, I was in college cooking on the floor of the dorm room with a little blender, making smoothies for everybody on the floor. And stress baking. Billy mentioned that we went to college together, and I would often just like stress bake, so there would be very elaborate desserts and things in the lounge area. I don't stress eat, I just stress cook, which worked out well when I had like another dorm full of people that I could just feed. So people thought I was like, they made friends with me because I would feed them, and they must have thought I was nice to feed them, but really I was just stressed out and avoiding engineering homework.
There always seems to be a lot of food.
What's that?
There always seems to be a lot of food people are using.
There's always a lot of food.
Yeah. Good food too.
I feel like that's how we look out for other people. We make sure that they're fed, they're taken care of. Okay, I just want this to be cooked all the way through. I'm gonna churn off this burner. Okay, so this meat is almost cooked. This beef was very, very lean. So I was kind of expecting more fat to come off of the beef. It did not. You can also, if you were doing this, you could put like fresh spinach in here and do like some wilted spinach or wild greens or lamb's quarter or whatever kind of additions you would want to make. I panicked. I was trying to turn these things off, and when they're off, they have this H on the thing that says hot, I'm assuming, but I was like, does it say high or hot? Because if it says high, that's not good. If it says it's hot and it's just cooling off, but it's off, then that's fine, so super fun. So I have my cooked bison. I'm gonna add this right to it, so you guys can see that's what my wild rice looks like, all cooked up. So as it cooks, those little grains expand. I'm gonna adjust this in my hand. Okay. And we can mix this together. We have one last step. Which is actually, have my roasted squash off to the side here. So what I'm going to do is actually, now that it's cooled and I can handle it better, I'm gonna scoop out some of this squash, and that's just gonna get mixed into here. Actually, I'm gonna scoop out a whole bunch of the acorn squash, because obviously we don't have enough acorn squashes to feed it. I mean, we don't have enough bowls to feed everybody, so instead what we're gonna do is we'll just give you filling in a regular bowl. And then what I normally do is I'll end up just basically enlarging this hole and then using some acorn squash still in the bowl, but then I'll fill the rest with this mixture, and then I'll use those as my serving things. So if I'm doing 4 people, we'll do 2 acorn squashes, et cetera, and that's like a good 1 bowl meal with all the things in it. For this, I had a very tiny convection oven, and so I was like, I can't even do 2 squashes in here with the way the trays are and having to toast the sunflower seeds. So it is a little different than a true stuffed squash because we're not stuffing the squash. It's a deconstructed stuffed squash. It's a sad lack of spoons in my spoon thing. So I'm going to get this washed off. And then, so this should come out very, very easily. If it is still hard and it's providing resistance, then your squash needs to be roasted longer. Acorn squash is also delicious just if you toss it in maple syrup and roast it like that, or slice it. you do it with delicata squash, you can have a winter squash that you can eat the skin of. So that's a cool thing. Some people will use brown sugar, but you can definitely do this with maple syrup. And when I say maple syrup, I'm obviously meaning like real maple syrup and not corn syrup or cane syrup flavored with maple flavoring. Just so everyone's clear.
So, Mariah, I have another question for you.
Of course.
So, I grew up on the East Coast, away from my community. I didn't really have in terms of like trying to incorporate like indigenous foods. That wasn't really ever a thing we did.
Yeah.
As growing up, and then as I've gotten older and worked more in this field, followed your careers, like I want to get more like into incorporating foods, both from where like the indigenous foods from where I live now, so Tucson, but also from where my tribe is located, in northern Mexico. So what are some like just steps or tips or suggestions you have for trying to incorporate more like native foods into the diet?
Good question. So I think one of the things that everybody can do is learn more about the plants in your area, even if it's just whipping out your phone and doing a plant ID in the parking lot of the store, right? That's what I was doing the other day. I was at a conference in Palm Springs, so I was in the desert of California, and I'm like, I have no idea what this plant is, but it looks really cool. What is it? And it was called a Jerusalem thorn. Well, why is it called that? It's indigenous to here, apparently. Why does it have the name Jerusalem? Because apparently Spanish people named it girasol, which is like faces the sun, and then somebody heard that and translated it as Jerusalem. So I got to learn a whole bunch about this cool plant, and I got to, just feel a little bit more like a welcome guest in a place that was not my home, but I got to learn a little bit more about just one of the plants that was outside a conference center. That said, sometimes you do that and you learn about edible plants when you're doing plant IDs. So, of course, mesquite, we know mesquite is an edible food that grows all over the place. And if you can learn about that, and you can learn about, well, how do we turn this thing that's growing here into food that I can eat and that I will enjoy, right? And then we can start diving into things from there. That said, also, of the world's food, 2/3 of it originated in the Americas. So lots of foods that we already have access to in grocery stores are from the Americas, whether North, Central, or South America. And just getting to learn some of those stories as we travel around the continents, connect with Native people. I think, like when we were down at the co-op today, I bought some saguaro cactus seeds. And I'm like, I'm just gonna buy these. I don't know what to use them for because I'm from Montana. We don't have saguaro cactus seeds, and I had never worked with them before. And so I'm checking out. I'm like, what do you do with these? And the guy there was like, oh well, our caterer will use them like poppy seeds, and you can use them like that, or you can mix them into a vinaigrette, like a salad dressing or something. It's just like a texture. And I'm like, cool, great. Now I have learned something else, and when I get back to the hotel room, I'll probably Google more things about it and just learn more about foods as I travel. I mean, you can just keep adding to your own knowledge base. Learn from Native people. If there are plant walks in your area, I like going on plant walks. Learn about the ways people incorporated foods. So if you think about like cactus, right? So prickly pear cactus and tunas, the fruits from prickly pear cactus, are such a popular food for a lot of people, right? They have these big seeds, and so, some people will just like eat the seeds and swallow them. And there's a really interesting story about a phenomenon that people were talking about in the desert. Anthropologists were noting that these cactuses seem to grow like right outside of people's houses. This was before the times of running water, I will mention. And so they were like, are people setting up their houses in these areas with cacti? Is it, or are they planting them, or what's going on? And there was this research that was done, and I think someone finally just observed people like eating. They're like, oh, you're just crunching through the seeds. But then they would like go to the bathroom outside, and then the cactuses would come up, so they would just form like a protective food forest outside. And it's just like part of plant knowledge, and it's kind of a funny story, but also it's like, yeah, that's also like indigenous land management. And it's a way of replanting foods, and without people eating those foods, right, those plants don't get to distribute their seeds in the same way, and people don't have the same access to those foods in the same way that they did. So just get to learn funny stories about foods and how to use them. So maybe not recommend that as the primary method of spreading cactuses now. But all right, so let's find bowls, which I know exist in the cupboard behind me. Billy, I'm probably gonna have you help me.
Yep, coming right up. So, just wanted to ask real quick also.
Yes.
Because you said you just used the Plant ID app. What did you use?
I use Google Lens actually, which if you have a Google phone, it's on your phone already, but I don't have a Google phone, so I just downloaded Google Lens, and I'll use that, which basically does a Google image search for whatever your camera's looking at. That's fine. That'll work. Okay, and then do we have spoons? Spoons is good. Spoons or forks? Either is good.
I'll wash my hands real quick.
Okay. Convection ovens. Not my friend. Okay. Over there. This is gonna be tossed. So what I'm gonna do is probably just get things blended up here. Set this off to the side. And get things. Cut these guys in half sizes, which is fine. Those are gonna cool off though.
So, we got these.
Don't do that, Billy.
I didn't think they were gonna fall off like that. I wasn't expecting this at all.
It's okay. Just. Okay. Here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna.
Now, I think, should we just put them out here and then
Yeah.
people come to?
Yep.
Okay, so we're just gonna put them out here, just on the table, and then people can come up and grab them. If you want them, I can come bring them to you as well, if that would be more comfortable for you.
If you would like food, go for it. If you would not, you can just sit right there, I guess. I don't know. Or you can raise your hand and Billy will bring you food.
Yeah, so this is the stuffed acorn squash.
Yeah, it's now been totally
A deconstructed stuffed
It's
acorn
a
squash.
deconstructed stuffed acorn
Squash
squash.
bowl.
A
Yeah.
squash bowl.
Yes.
A great idea.
Yeah.
I'd love to keep the seeds if you're gonna get rid of them.
Yeah. I was gonna ask if anybody wanted them. Sorry, I was like, I'm gonna throw these away
Oh,
in
yeah.
case anybody wants them. It's
And there's also a
Or
really
you-
great app, it's called Picture This.
Okay.
I use like a $30 subscription for the year, but it's really great for identifying class.
are getting close to the end. Thank you everybody for coming out. You know, it's like we really appreciate it. Part of our programming for digital well-being is just to bring a variety of different presenters, talk about their path to where they are now, talk about the ways they promote wellness, and you know, just show like you know some amazing like native creators doing some amazing things. And yeah, like you know, this should be delicious. And thank you to Natural Grocers. They've been outstanding for this. They supplied us with the demonstration space as well as all of our ingredients again. So we can't thank them enough. And so yeah, and you know, most importantly, thank you guys for coming out to support us. So, yeah, we're just gonna be presenting the food now, and so you know, demonstration as well as stay. You guys can have conversations and talk if you want. Have questions for Mariah, but I think this is just about the end of the actual demonstration part. So thank you again.
Cool.
Delicious.
Yes.
Thanks, guys. I didn't even use salt on this, so maybe there's salt.